welcome everybody. As Heather said, this is the first of our law school webinars of 2022. I've been hosting these now for 2 years, and they've generally gone from strength to strength, and it's a way that the law school can share its scholarship and research with our alumni and members of the public more widely. And I'm delighted to do it, and I'm delighted that a present and a former colleague have joined me tonight, who are experts on climate change and in the Conference of the Parties 26 that occurred in Glasgow late last year. And I'm joined tonight by Nicolas Maulet, a lecturer in the law school, a present colleague of mine, who amongst other things teaches energy law and an expert on climate change, who was involved in some hosting and taking part in events in Aberdeen during the conference. And my former colleague, sorely missed still, I dare say, Alison Stewart, former lecturer, solicitor, director of Aberdeen Climate Action. Let me get this right. Founder and manager of NESCAN Hub. Is that correct? Alison will correct me if I'm wrong. Excellent. And Alison was involved in the conference down in Glasgow itself. So we just had a little discussion previous, and I think one thing that I would be very interested in hearing, and I'm sure you would, is the experience and insights gained by Nicolas and Alison in the course of the conference, leading up to it, the course of it, and then we can move on for the second half of our webinar to the future. What will happen, going forward? Will the climate crisis, if that's what I'm appropriately calling it, will it be, does it look like it will be sufficiently tackled, if that's the word, or not? Okay, great. So we're going to do this, and as Heather said, we'll have probably 30-40 minutes of a presentations and discussion amongst ourselves, and then if you guys have questions arising, please do put them in the chat box, and we'll address them at the end. Okay, if I could firstly start with Nicolas and then to Alison. Welcome, Nicolas. Thank you very much for coming. I wonder if you could just explain about COP26 a little bit. What was its purpose? How did it arise? And in your perspective of the event.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. And it's really a pleasure to see you all here tonight. I have Alison with us as well, because Alison has been very involved in Glasgow with COP26. I was involved in pre-COP26 events, including with the Scottish Government. And we did a number of events with RGU and UNA Scotland, which is the United Nations Associations for Scotland, that were sectorial events around COP26. And that was extremely important because we wanted to give a platform to business leaders, civil society leaders from Scotland, and hear their views, in a sense, collect also their sense of what it is to decarbonize the economy, what it is to deliver towards what is actually the whole exercise of COP and the Paris Agreement, which is to prevent global warming to reach a certain level. So maybe I'm happy to leave the floor to Alison and tell us about maybe what she has felt was being part of Glasgow, and how did it unfold for Climate Cafe and her other organization.
Yeah, so we were really lucky that we managed to get a spot in the Green Zone. So that was North East Scotland Climate Action Network, on our community, our choices topic. So what we really felt was we wanted to make sure that communities were listened to and are listened to and co-create the world that we all want. So we went out into communities and had loads of different community events where we went and asked people to vision what they wanted their community to look like by 2030, which was really good. We also had a really successful primary school and secondary school competition where we asked the children to do that too. And we got all sorts of different things, from Minecraft videos, stop-start Lego videos, to plays, to poetry, to just like pictures. It was amazing. And we also did a questionnaire. So we took all that information and we created a video, and we had artists coming along to the events, and we had an artist to create the kind of overall arching picture, and we took that all to COP with us, and we had a stall at the Green Zone, and that was really good. I have to say that the Green Zone didn't seem to heat up till quite late in the morning, and it wasn't very well signposted. So those are some of the negatives, but the real positives were meeting everybody that came from different countries across the world, which is really great, and just having the chats and and that collaboration and just coming together. And that's really, really positive, to really feel that you're in part of a global movement. I was also invited by the Scottish Government to talk at a few of their events at the Lighthouse. So they took over the Lighthouse just up Buchanan Street in Glasgow and had a weekend or so of events there. So I spoke at an event with a couple of ministers and the head of the Just Transition Commission as well. So academics involved as well, about how community can, community involvement in just transition, and also was involved in the energy aspects too, went along to that one as well, which was great. I think for me, the highlight of the whole time that I was at COP, I was there for about 4 days, was the march, was the on the Sunday, which is absolutely fantastic to be part of something with such momentum and such energy from across the whole world, with over 100,000 people marching with you, was just something to behold. And that for me is a highlight, because it just goes to show that civil society had a real energy. I wasn't as impressed by by governmental. The Blue Zone was rightly slated for being inaccessible in relation to disability, and inaccessible in relation to civil society. So whereas usually you have lots of observers, it was notable that there was the least observers ever, any COP, and the most business influence at COP in the Blue Zone. So that was really quite negative. A lot of times researchers have space in the COP, and they didn't really get that this time around. So that's just some kind of anecdotal kind of remarks from colleagues at Aberdeen University who were there as observers in the Blue Zone. So that's my kind of thoughts about actually being at COP. In relation to what the outcomes of COP were, I'm not a huge expert. Obviously there are lots of summaries out there, but it was disappointing. Without a doubt, it was disappointing that we didn't get what we really needed there, which we needed much more commitment from governments. We need much more leadership from the UK government, and we definitely needed something on the kind of on the financing to countries that really are the most affected, who are the least deserving getting it, because really it's the richer countries that really driven our carbon emissions. And yeah, so anyway, I'll pass back to Nicolas for some more info on that.
Okay, well, thank you. Firstly, thank you, Alison. Very interesting insights. I mean, some of you right hands on the ground and involving such a wide, different, varieties of people. Excellent, and hopefully instilling interest and enthusiasm in, say, you mentioned school children or younger people to really become concerned. And I think from seeing story or photos of the march or videos of the march, certainly all sorts of younger people to all the way up, and taking part. Nicolas, I wonder if you could follow on from Alison's point about, maybe just the purpose in a grander scale of attempting to secure international agreements and between developed countries and underdeveloped countries and so forth. Please.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I really appreciate what Alison explained about the importance of seeing the whole COP exercise, especially this year at Glasgow, was about involving communities, because at the end of the day, we can have all these conferences, and it's not just me talking like this, it's including the General Secretary of the UN. We can have all these conferences, we can have all these gathering, if at the end of the day, people on the ground, communities, organizations, government, local governments in particular, don't take ownership in terms of delivering climate action, nothing is going to be happening. So, sometimes people are cynical about including what they see from civil society at COPs, being very noisy, being misbehaving on the streets, but it's about each and every one of us. And that is something that really needs to be kept, at the back of any observer's mind. And I think, exploring COP26 precisely requires both understanding this framework and the stakeholders, the actors. So we heard the civil society, but also the business community. It's very, very important to see that it's not governments who are going to be spending the billions required. It's going to be investment. So sometimes people criticize, oh, why is this big guy coming? And I'm not going to be mentioning names, but it's because at the end of the day, delivery of investment and climate action rests on businesses across the world. I would say largely on businesses. Decarbonization comes from industries, and not just heavy industries, including SMEs and all sorts of companies of all sorts and business and specialties. So it's a global exercise, and therefore everybody has a case to be at COP26, COP or COP26, COP27 this year. But as I said, you know, COP26 was just a milestone and within a wider framework. And people need to remember that historically, climate action within the UN gained momentum quite a long time ago now, because it was in 1992 when a conference known as the Earth Summit, you may remember it, was held in Rio in 1992. And in fact, this Earth Summit marked 20 years of another milestone, which was the 1972 Stockholm United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. That's the whole name of this 1972 conference. That was the first real significant gathering around the international community around the human environment and its future. And the Rio Earth Summit, so 20 years later, was itself the climax of a process, like Paris was and Glasgow were the climaxes of processes. But so the Earth Summit brought, after a good 3 years of hard work since 1989, a number of instruments. One of them was called Agenda 21, and it established international partnerships for developing sustainable development policies worldwide, so a very, very broad ambition. And also we had the all-important United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is also known as the UNFCCC, UNFCCC, but people say UNFCCC. And I think there were also two other conventions in 1992, one on biodiversity and the other one on desertification. But Rio took place, as I said, in 1992, and the convention, the UNFCCC, entered into force in March 1994. So since these dates, the signatories to the convention, also known as the parties to the convention, have been meeting each year in what is called the Conference of the Parties. So hence the COP acronym, which stands for Conference of the Parties. And Glasgow became COP26 because it was scheduled to take place in 2020, but apparently there was a virus. So it took place 26 years, actually 27 years after the entry into force of the UNFCCC convention. And Paris was COP21 because it took place in 2015, 21 years after in 1994. So the UNFCCC was very important to globally recognize and make that connection between human development and climate change on a global basis, because we have 197 countries that have ratified the convention. It's also something people need to realize is how whole-encompassing these conventions are. And so the UNFCCC is all about managing greenhouse gas emissions so that concentrations do not lead to transforming the climate. And this approach also recognized something which sounds trite to many of us, but recognize just the role of science in the understanding and the fight against climate change. And I'm saying this with a smile because I can't help thinking of what we heard during the Trump administration and some also climate skeptics, you know, but at least it's in international law that science is here to assist and to make sure that we work against global warming. And this.
Okay, sorry, if I could just interrupt just for a second. Okay, Nicolas, that was an excellent, and I want you to come back to that. So hold your thought about setting the stage of the international framework that led us up to COP, which you've just done so excellently. And I could turn to Alison just for a second to follow on a point that you made earlier, and it's maybe the connection between this international agreement and the Paris Accord moving on in the previous UN conventions you mentioned to Glasgow and further, and that connection between those agreements and I guess the UK government, but particularly the Scottish government or local government, Alison, which I know I think you're more involved in, and to try to see an on-the-ground manifestation of these. Is there, and I mean, if I'm certainly not a climate change skeptic at all, but I wonder if sometimes I doubt maybe the effectiveness of some of these treaties, even though if the UK agrees to do something, you know, will the Scottish government oblige indeed Aberdeen City Council to something that I would see every day, maybe recycling targets or, you know, hydrogen buses or something. Could you, if I'm not asking you a question that you're gonna be happy with, Alison, just give us some explanation of that, you know, a local manifestation from your perspective, and then we'll come back to the international aspect.
Sure. I mean, so we have obviously the governments, the parties to the convention signing up, and we have all these commitments, national commitments it's called, that currently we're not even anywhere near 1.5. So we're something like 2.3 or something.
2.7 even.
2.7. It varies with all the different different calculations, but we're nowhere near that. So the UK government has committed to being net zero by 2050. The Scottish government is committed to being net zero by 2045. What we have not got, though, is the trickle down commitments onto local government yet. So there's no legal obligation on local authorities to make their regions net zero by that time, although there is obligations on local authorities to report on having that on targets. So what we have at the moment at a very local level is we have an Aberdeen City Council. They have developed a net zero vision and action plan and commitments for themselves getting to net zero by 2045. And what I'm involved with as well with a number of different other stakeholders in the city is creating a 2045 route map for the area. Unfortunately, it does not cover Aberdeen City and Shire, it's just city. From Aberdeenshire perspective, they haven't really got a climate change plan yet, and they certainly haven't got one that's regional, taking a leadership role. But what they do have is an adaptation. So that's adapting to the effects of climate change. They've got Climate Ready Aberdeenshire. Stepping back a moment to the Scottish government level, they are actually putting in place quite a lot of different policies to try and get us to net zero. But if you look at the Committee for Climate Change, which is a parliamentary committee for the UK government, you will see that there's some skepticism about how they can actually reach those targets. So the action is missing. And that is very, very normal, because what's happened is Scotland's one of the very few countries in this world that are committed to getting to net zero by 2045. It's quite an ambitious target. Well, it's not as ambitious as some, but it is still fairly ambitious. But the trouble is, it's fast approaching, and there's not been sufficient action yet to get us there. So it's difficult to see how we're going to get there, but there is a lot of really good policies coming out there. So what I'm involved with, obviously, is community-wise. That's where we got the funding to be a community, regional community climate action hub. So we are the first, one of two pilot schemes to do that, and it's going to looking to put hubs in every single region in Scotland to develop and support community climate action. There's a lot of different initiatives and visions coming in, from climate action towns to deposit schemes, recycling, to this is in every single sector there are plans, but what we need is more than plans now. We need real action and a real kind of route map of how we're going to get there in practical terms. The Scottish government is much further ahead than the UK government. But when you look at, say, for instance, climate emergency, I've got just last week I've launched their site where you can go and have a look at your local authority and see how it's doing. More of the English local authorities have got climate action plans. And especially in London, they're quite ambitious. So actually, even though they're not legally obliged to, a lot of local authorities are taking the lead. But it's not done in a concerted fashion. What I've been advocating in all sorts of areas of power is that we need to have the trickle down. We need to have, it's not good enough to have a national target. We need actual route map for the whole country to get there, and the trickle down of legal obligations and regulations. And one of the things we really need is twofold in relation to law. The moment we have a presumption for development in planning, which doesn't link into any need for there to be any net zero aspects of that. And secondly, we have this whole kind of maximizing oil and gas reserves still at the heart of our government's strategy in relation to energy. These kind of mismatches in policy and practice need to be addressed. We need coherence and clarity, and we need mainstreaming of getting to net zero, because without us actually taking action on the climate, we won't have a livable world, and everything else is secondary to that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to, okay, now, Nicholas, I want that maybe ties in back to where we were at COP then, and was there uh, conclusions that you think that addressed some of these lack of action initiatives sufficiently, either in a UK context or globally? I mean, I know a lot of the issues maybe are a lot larger between developed and developing states, and the transfer of resources from those who've already enriched themselves
Yeah.
is at the cost of the planet to those who are in the process of developing.
Well, thanks very much. And just a quick reaction to what Alison described, to put it in perspective with what your question, I think it's an extraordinary display of actual very hard and positive thinking at local level, because this is what something like a COP doesn't bring you. A COP doesn't bring you local action. A COP doesn't even bring you national action unless governments take ownership of delivering on the climate objectives. Nothing happens. And I would say nothing happens even more in countries like the UK, for instance, where the role of local governments is actually essential. Cities, again, communities, as Alison mentioned several times, need to take ownership of the delivery, and they will find support because there are schemes coming, including money coming, but it belongs to communities to realize that they have to take ownership. And what is very nice, or quite marvelous to see, is that in terms of really delivering, including in the least developed countries, we're seeing actors who used to be regarded as almost amusement at COPs that are now being empowered to become the actors of their communities to help towards decarbonization. And so more and more is going to be done locally. And coming back to the UK, it's very important that cities, in particular local governments, take ownership of decarbonization, because like we're seeing in Aberdeen, the Lord Provost is a ardent defender of decarbonization. We're one of the very first UK cities to have a hydrogen bus, as you know, and it's being shared across the globe that Aberdeen has a hydrogen fuel cells, buses. So all of this is in a very good dynamic for the city, and I personally hope that we can see more. But going back to your question, yes. The Paris Agreement, which was another milestone in this UNFCCC framework that I mentioned, was important because it defined the first pillars of climate action across the international community, having had 194 signatories and being ratified the next year. And COP26 in that respect was also important because it was scheduled to take place 5 years after COP21. And the parties have to meet 5 years later, not just to discuss progress on climate action, but to, and Alison mentioned them, to disclose what is called the nationally determined contributions. And this is not just spelling out, it's an exercise of transparency, of information sharing and commitment to deliver on priorities and ambitions, to keep working on a national basis. Again, remember, how important it is to transcribe these policy objectives towards delivering a 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature increase scenario. This is a very important item, because I'm sure that you've understood that the Paris Agreement was an agreement coming with multiple undertakings, with the introduction of frameworks that either called for actually further work from the COP parties, or that had to be immediately kick-started in order to delivering. But Glasgow, therefore, was important because the parties had committed to meet again and to see how they would have been progressing on policies and delivery in the meantime. And this was a very important milestone, because we must remember the opposition including the United States and the Trump administration to the Paris Agreement, and how the US pulled out of the agreement in November 2020. So your question, I think, was about what did we see at Glasgow? Well, Glasgow did not give rise to an international convention. Alison, I heard you say that, yes, you were disappointed. There are many reasons to be disappointed about Glasgow. There's also a way of looking at it like the glass half full and the glass half empty. I'm disappointed on finance. Absolutely, it was the conclusion about phasing down as opposed to phasing out coal. But maybe we can come back on this. But on finance, very, very big disappointment. But Glasgow gave rise to a number of decisions. And that's why actually we talk about a package of decisions, which is identified as the Glasgow Climate Pact. We don't have a convention. And we can see, first of all, that Glasgow confirmed that the Paris Agreement's dynamic is actually working across the international community. So if we think like people who observe policymakers and the law, I think what was very good about the COP was that it worked. It could have been a disaster like Copenhagen was, for instance, to some extent. But at least Glasgow confirmed that the international community is buying into the UNFCCC and now the Paris Agreement framework. What the Paris Agreement has therefore achieved is to put pressure on the parties. And I think some American experts is talking about the psychological pressure, the psychological element being so important, including to take nations that are reticent or still dragging their feet into the climate dynamic. But it put pressure on the parties to work together against climate change, more than actually it, in fact, is capable of assigning detailed obligations, because the detailed obligations, they actually are self-generated. The nationally determined contributions are there to show that governments are by themselves committing to delivering on a new form of climate action, enhanced ambitions, more plans, more policies. So what is good, was very good to say at Glasgow is that it's causing nations to move and to deliver. And there is a pressure to deliver. And again, the NDCs, we've seen a number of countries, it was a very good thing, raising their nationally determined contributions, even if we saw, probably as a result of, again, the negative influence of the Trump administration, a number of countries not improving their NDCs, such as Brazil, Mexico, or even Australia. But overall, we had like 150 countries that have increased their NDCs. And we need, of course, to do more, because that's another thing we all need to remember about the reality of this process is at the moment we're moving towards a scenario where the global temperature is going to be rising by 2.7 degrees centigrade. And that's a lot more than what is the 1.5 Paris Agreement target, a target that is maintained, but is not guaranteed. So we absolutely need to work, when I say we, the international community, but also at national levels and local level. We need to work hard. But if we still want to look at the positive outcomes of Glasgow, we have seen a number of coalitions arising. So again, interestingly, it's how we see frameworks arising under the names of coalitions, partnerships, alliances, because it's bringing together groups and stakeholders that have very different or very distinct identities, but have reasons to work together. So we're seeing a number of coalitions arising on things like deforestation, on fossil fuel finance, which, for instance, pledges no more support to investments where projects do not come with a carbon capture solution. There's also been something very interesting at some point, which was this declaration on methane emissions by China and the US that shows that, well, there is still a capacity for these countries to cooperate on climate regardless of other diplomatic issues. And we've also seen a number of initiatives on biodiversity. And something that was also very important, Alison mentioned the net zero targets for the UK and Scotland, but we've seen a number of countries committing towards achieving net zero. So again, we know for the UK, the EU, including the USA, we're looking towards 2050 for net zero, 2045 for Scotland, but China and India have also joined this. And China is now looking at net zero by 2060 and India by 2070. So people might be saying, oh, again, big announcements, symbols, this is not committing. Well, actually, this is very important, in practice, because these targets help send the right signal to the market and for investment, because they mean that if governments want to achieve net zero at these dates, they need to ramp up their support to new investments now. They will need to start investing in infrastructure, all sorts of new equipment, all sorts of, again, broadly speaking, investments. They will need to invest for investment that will start delivering in 2030 if we want to see net zero by 2050, 60 or 70. And the net zero commitments are very important because precisely they put, especially the development banks, on a clear pathway to understand how investment should be prioritized while we're moving towards 2030. And remember, 2030 is in less than 8 years.
Yes, not long at all, Nicolas. Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. I mean, you brought in, investment, and that certainly brings to my mind, business. And I saw, Alison, in your chat box that, I don't know if business is committed, or there has been a general commitment to the end of oil and gas. And I'm sure maybe from your discussions in Aberdeen, I'm sure this comes up. And we were having I don't know, are you allowed to say you had a social event? I don't know, with all these lockdown things anyways, but and a few people that worked in that sector appeared to me to be resigned to the fact that your oil and gas is on its way out, and but whether how long or tapered that slowdown will be, I don't know. But I wonder if you, Alison, just from your reference to business at the COP conference and your experiences in Aberdeen, if you could discuss, and give us your view on the role of business in the climate change internationally, in Scotland, and locally.
So business has to be involved, and it can be a really positive agent for change. But I suppose part of the problem with business being involved in COP, because actually I don't feel like business should be at COP in the blue zone, in the sense that it's a convention of parties, it should be governments there, and that we should not have lobbying groups there, and that is the issue. So where we have great big lobbying groups from fossil fuels, there's definitely a conflict there. And what we're seeing is a huge amount of pressure on governments, not just from fossil fuels, but also from the building industry to slow down change. And that is really quite dangerous. So we're going through at the moment, and in Scotland, a national planning framework for consultation, and that is going to set the whole scene for the whole of the planning for the next, I don't know, 25 years. It's massive, and it's really important. But all the kind of large volume house builders are getting in on it, and they really watered down a lot of the protections to get to net zero. And that's what we're seeing. And we're seeing in every single industry is the amount of lobbying and pressure put on government, which then does water down very necessary climate change commitments. So that is the issue that I have negatively in relation to business. But what we see in business a lot of times is people wanting to know how they can. So SMEs are like, well, how can we do this? And what we need is commitment to more climate literacy training, and more resources for business, and more incentives for business. And that can come from regulation, or it can come from money, basically. And that's what we need as well. And we saw it in COP as well, kind of the bigger companies as well, coming together to say, we'll put money towards this, we'll put money towards net zero technology, we'll put money towards investment. You've got different organizations, for instance, Bankers Without Boundaries, working on financing for net zero, trying to come up with some kind of investment packages so that regions and cities can access the money that's needed to make the changes, because obviously it is really quite expensive, although you have to say that the amount spent and actually mismanaged and bungled, particularly the UK government, the corruption there with the COVID contracts, that money, if that had gone to net zero, could have made a massive amount of difference. So yes, business can be very much the answer. We have to ensure that we actually do invest in entrepreneurism and new business. What we found in the ScotWind leasing round just now, so Scotland, but just recently, about a week or two ago, put the licenses for offshore wind farms on the market, was that the big boys, the oil and gas companies, swept in, and they're not based there. The money doesn't flow back to Scotland for these companies, and the only kind of floating wind production company that we have that was really going on that didn't win it. And we also saw there was no supply chain conditions on it, so there was no conditions that you can have, and you would assume that would be in there to really ensure that there was community wealth building in areas in Scotland that really need it. So in all the kind of oil and gas producing regions where we're going to see a huge downturn with a decrease in oil and gas productions, we really need investment in just transition. And what that means is not putting money in the big boys' pockets to go into shareholders. It means actually creating new opportunities, new businesses, new companies, and supporting the newer companies to really thrive here in the region.
Excellent, thank you, Nicolas. I wonder if you wanted to follow on for that, or and give your final comments for the next few minutes, because I want to give our guest as many minutes for questions as they can. So if you wanted to give your final insights into the COP process and generally the climate change situation today.
Yeah, thanks very much. I would have loved to, of course, answer to what Alison said, but I generally share her view. I would say there's a clear case to distinguish between the lobbying actions and the involvement of business as part of not the COP process. The COP process is between the parties, it's governments, and that's why it's very, very important and is absolutely safe, I think, from external influences, even though it's listening very carefully, of course, to what the civil society is saying. But I think, going back to your point, Paul, which is about in fact, what could be the future of governance for climate action. As I said, it's very important to realize that, yes, we have this very impressive gathering now of 194 countries that is going to be meeting in Egypt this year for COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Another important milestone, because it's not every five years now, it's every year that the NDCs are going to be put under scrutiny. So, the pressure is ramping up. And what we're seeing is really that there are new dynamics operating. So the COP is one thing, partnerships around the COPs are also there. A number of forums and initiatives are gaining momentum. The Race to Zero, for instance, or what is being led by Mark Carney in relation to finance. But I must still, despite the positive, stress that indeed all this took 26 years, if you look carefully, to give rise to some instruments. And we had some conventions. I mentioned the Paris Agreement, but the rest is decisions, if you want, and other forms of less binding instruments. So some important decisions were taken at Glasgow precisely as a result of the adoption and the entry into force of the Paris Agreement that binds its signatories. But we see that there is a need for more muscle that has to be put into these negotiations, into the delivery plans and actions that will need the world again to decarbonize and prevent global warming from reaching levels that, 2.7 is a very bad news. It will make life extremely difficult to a lot of populations. And this is exactly the scenario these days. We are actually 1.2 above the 1.5 base scenario, and having global temperature rising by 1.2 degrees more is a nightmare and is going to be a cause of war and tension. So we need, therefore, that the governance of climate action be strengthened, and we need to invest in this new governance. And let me make a current analogy. Alison mentioned the COVID crisis. When you look at the way the COVID crisis has been managed on a global scale, showing how including the most developed countries have been playing a very selfish nationalistic game, despite the global dimension of the pandemic, by, for instance, purchasing vaccines, including against the interest of their own allies. So in this very uncoordinated way, we can see that if there has been a governance missing to address this global challenge, and regardless of how countries might be thinking that they're coming out of the pandemic successfully, managing the pandemic did not rest on very sophisticated policies and plans. And so in a sense, the challenge was quite clear and certainly less sophisticated than working against global warming. So it's very important to see that if the international community wants to deliver against climate change at the scale of the investments, the policy initiatives, the coordination required, what we're talking about is a need for a governance that really makes and keeps governments accountable and also business accountable for delivering what is needed in terms of transforming our economy. As we all know, it's not about waging on efficiency just for the sake of it. It's because science tells us that the future of the planet is going to be in a very bad place if pollution is not dramatically reduced. One of the very big challenges in terms of building a new governance for this global climate action is that we have to read this challenge against very nationalistic attitudes when it comes to a global project that includes nations engaging with significant domestic reforms. So how does this connect in terms of political theory? It connects to the issue of sovereignty. You need to realize that the international community is constantly being reminded that the COP parties are very happy to be part of a global effort and a number of global initiatives, so long as due respect is being given to their sovereignty. If not, we are likely to see quite a lot of rebellions and failures, and that's an expression, if you want, of the need for local having to meet global. That's, I think, and vice versa. So there's going to be a real progress on climate change from the international community only if we now move from what still is rather voluntary, declaratory approaches to frameworks that really give substance to the COP decisions and that aim at keeping governments accountable. And people might be saying, well, what do you have in mind? Well, I believe, for instance, that there are precedents within the UN framework, and at the UN level, something that has been working quite well is the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that works alongside rules, for instance, that are globally accepted, and that comes also with a way to put pressure on governments through a dispute resolution process. And so within the WTO system, we have a dispute resolution system that can hold governments accountable when they violate international trade rules. And this is what we need for climate. We need a set of tools to protect against climate change and protect the environment, including by using tools that actually belong to international trade. And the WTO framework could be used to now ban exports from markets where countries do not observe policies and rules that are aimed at decarbonizing and that connects to the issues of having a price for carbon, for instance, now in our economies. So you see,
but Nicolas, sorry to just butt in. I have to say though that from the opposite side, you have agreements between countries that include clauses that allow companies then to take countries to court, as it were, in relation to when they're trying to reduce their carbon emissions, when they're trying to say stop oil and gas production, like licensing, or to phase out certain things, and they're using those very courts to stop action on climate.
Yes, well, precisely that's why we need to take a lot of this debate out of the courts. I think that we've seen a number of court cases, especially in Holland recently, and even though I'm absolutely pro-climate justice, a lot of what has to do with international trade and the discipline of international trade, because of the size of the impact required, needs to be based on a wider system. And I think, and it's not just me thinking this way, it's including Harvard research and European research, we absolutely need to have a new system of global governance for climate based precisely not just on penalties, but also on rules, including, again, playing with the international trade rules that support different ways of thinking. And we know that every manufacturing country, for instance, wants to sell, if not just in European countries, to OECD countries. And having a ban on high carbon imports as part of the WTO mechanism would make sure that these rules are drastically adhered to, and that is, if such a standard is not met, there could be a risk of sanctions by other WTO countries who could legally refuse these imports. So
okay, thank you, Nicolas. A very interesting section. I think that must be our next webinar on how the WTO could be used. And I know I used to teach a little bit of this law. I know a little bit about this banana dispute, and sometimes trade law can be used for the benefit of the so-called underdog, or indeed maybe the environment, and sometimes trade law could be used for opposite purposes, as Alison was just alluding to. But a very interesting suggestion, and I agree, would be the judicialization of some environmental agreements. And there's other, not only trade law, I mean, as Alison would know, I'm sure, and certain human rights precedents that have been decided about climate change and the rising water levels in Pacific countries and so forth. But anyways, a fascinating discussion. Thank you guys both tremendously for taking part.